Hello everybody, Brian from the Existentialism Brian here, and it's time to review the new Netflix original, I'm Thinking of Ending Things. Or at least try to. The most concise way I can review I'm Thinking of Ending Things is that it is a Charlie Kaufman film. If you're not familiar, Charlie Kaufman is the screenwriter behind films like Being John Malkovich, Adaptation, and most famously Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind. He branched out into directing in 2008 with Synecdoche, New York, and really began as he meant to go on with distinctly non-commercial plots that are almost incomprehensible unless you're looking at them through the same specific lens of existential dread that he is. A man I can only describe as Woody Allen if his self-deprecation wasn't masking narcissism and he actually hated himself. For all the faults one may find in his films, I don't think you can call Kaufman insincere. He's so obviously afraid of death, aging, relationships, and the inability to understand what constitutes a well-realized life, and that certainly comes through in this film. But right off the bat, I can tell I'm Thinking of Ending Things will probably validate whatever it is you think of him. Just like every one of his other scripts, I'm Thinking of Ending Things is a massive think piece about life and regret, eventually leaving behind any structural facets that may ground it in a literal story. Even if it's based on a book, I don't think Kaufman can help leaving enough fingerprints to repurpose it as his own story. But is the movie any good? It's hard to say. There's definitely something threatening about reviewing movies by a guy who sees life and by extension his own work the way Kaufman does. And to be fair, I'm Thinking of Ending Things is a slightly less oppressively miserable thought exercise than Synecdoche, New York, and definitely Anomalisa. The trade-off being a much more static framework on a scene-by-scene basis. Whether it's Being John Malkovich or Synecdoche, New York, there was always a narrative in Kaufman's other films you could attach yourself to that followed the film's broader messages. But with I'm Thinking of Ending Things, I question how much you can get out of it if you're not looking at the experience like a book report. And it isn't the kind of movie that just feeds you random bullshit expecting you to construct your own meaning from the ground up. I said Kaufman shouldn't be described as insincere, but another adjective that shouldn't go anywhere near him is random. There's clearly a blueprint of questions and themes and metaphors with many connections you can make to those things after just watching it once. The question isn't whether or not deeper meanings are there, it's whether or not they're compelling. For the most part, they are. In terms of presentation, the most consistent theme is change as it relates to personal choice. I'm Thinking of Ending Things as a turn of phrase would typically denote suicide, but Kaufman uses it to elaborate on how we satiate our personal desire to feel control over our lives when confronting how linear they are. When faced with nothing but routine, we crave a sense of agency, and so as long as we're doing something else, it doesn't matter because we're willing to fill in the blanks that it was our own decisions that got us there, so long as it satiates that craving. Even as the title does relate to suicide, I'm Thinking of Ending Things proposes the desire to take one's life as deeply rooted in a desire for change to engender control. Many times throughout the film, a character will say or do something that doesn't really make sense to interrupt an awkward silence, or as something that should logically not be taking so long just refuses to happen. They're defying the nature of passive linearity. Now, I love the way Kaufman implements these kinds of connections in his scripts, but for somebody who does not care about that and just wants a good story, the conversations in this film go on for so long I can see people losing their comprehension of what is happening as a scene enters its 23rd minute of pivoting into different, seemingly random topics of discussion. I can't imagine how annoyed I'd be if I were just somebody who heard about I'm Thinking of Ending Things as a new Netflix original without an inkling of who Charlie Kaufman is and what he's about. Attempting to disseminate things that maybe you don't have to be writing a thesis to get out of it, I'm Thinking of Ending Things has an adequately low-key indie vibe as a relationship drama. Jessie Buckley anchors the movie with a truly great and natural performance. Surrealist elements that leak in towards the end that are a little more blatant, unwrite who the protagonist is depending on how you interpret them, but the majority of the film is about the inner workings of her mind. Quite honestly, her not being the protagonist sounds a little reductive. Toni Collette and David Thewlis give great performances as well, but their roles are a little more for thematic sake than anything else. The central argument of I'm thinking of ending things, lacking much for people not aiming to dissect it, has less to do with an audience being unable to understand it, and more how Charlie Kaufman is choosing to exercise his power as a writer-director. There are two kinds of dialogue in this movie. Things Charlie Kaufman has definitely actually said, and everything else. Scenes will just be carrying on like normal, and a character will start randomly spouting these Charlie Kaufman-esque platitudes. His directorial exploits especially are no stranger to these sermonic monologues that, yes, are meaningful when falling back on appropriate substance. But I'm thinking of ending things seems so overly pleased with itself, as if that is the substance. Nothing else in Kaufman's direction feels quite as planned out by comparison. It doesn't matter how meaningful the film is when it's so transparently a manifesto. That is severing my connection as an audience member. In certain pseudo-intellectual film communities, the A24 mood of filmmaking and its curated mise-en-scène has become its own rigid comfort zone, and it automatically makes something kino. So filmmakers can fall back on that aesthetic even if they have no creativity but want to sound smart. And I can see people thinking that's what's going on here. And okay, I can't vouch for Kaufman's reasoning behind each and every one of his choices in this, but if you told me that influence was there, I wouldn't be surprised in the slightest. Because I'm thinking of ending things already teeters at the edge of being a disguised lecture, the seeming regression into r/movie crowd-pleasing A24 quirk, the digs at other films and filmmakers, and the annoying wealth of literary references that seem like cheap grabs at art house ethos create a dialectic tension I don't think Kaufman is self-aware enough to know is there, between trying to appeal to as many people as possible and just professing his own genius. While I certainly crave movies that provoke an audience to think, I'm very much against attempted intellectual cinema becoming an in-crowd. Praising I'm thinking of ending things, to me, is a vote for cinema as super-saturated subtext over anything experiential. Surrealism for the sake of surrealism. Just cannon fodder. Just cannon fodder for ending explained videos. It's not devoid of substance completely, Kaufman's not asserting himself as the next Horodowski and getting rid of anything that isn't a metaphor. There's just enough to use as a foundation for the themes he wants to get across. The ending will definitely be a deciding factor for your enjoyment, regardless of what frame you're watching this movie from. It is where the greatest amount of casual viewers are probably going to get lost, and depending on one's interpretation, could recontextualize the rest of the movie in a very negative way. What to me looked like a fresh story about self-actualization, depending on how deep you take its twist, has Kaufman unwrite all of that development and falling back on tired, samey, boilerplate, surrealist, unreliable narrator means I'm smart revelations instead. Look, this movie's fine. There are problems I have with I'm thinking of ending things parasocial qualities, but much of the movie itself is very meaningful as a piece of art. In a way, I almost wish it were worse, or at least more up its own ass, like Anomalisa, because then I could dismiss it as not really worth the trouble it would take to understand it. Now I have to try and say something insightful, and hey, who wants that? Scoring this seems a little difficult given the hard mix of Kaufman's best and worst qualities on display here. It is definitely my second least favorite Charlie Kaufman film after Anomalisa, I can tell you that much. Right now I'm feeling a 7, maybe a 6, depending on how it ages after a rewatch. There's the idea that people who review movies have very static opinions because they are a film reviewer and therefore understand their eternal thoughts on movies for all time before it's even halfway over. But that's just not the reality. I'm tired of talking about this movie, so if you like not only words, but the way I arrange and then say them, please consider liking and subscribing to manipulate the YouTube algorithm in my favor.